Juniors, let me welcome you again to the world of Western philosophy. If this week wasn't already an indication, this course is going to stretch your minds as you think about the history of philosophy as it developed in the West. And that has a lot of implications, both for how we look at history in general, especially in the world that we live in today. In the United States, we have been immensely impacted by Western philosophy, but also just how we think about the nature of reality and things. This is, in many senses, both a history course and a philosophy course. We're going to be walking through the development of ideas. And as we devoted our whole class on the first day of classes to ideas have extreme consequence. It's worth keeping that in mind on the foreground. What we're doing is perhaps more akin to like a gun safety course, where I am simultaneously telling you how to use philosophy, but I'm also giving you some warnings and saying how not to misuse philosophy. There have been many individuals throughout the years who have suffered the consequences of radical ideas, not only their own ideas, but even the ideas of others. Wars have been fought, revolutions have been made, families have been divided, and empires have risen and fallen over ideas. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do in philosophy. I wanted to give you a brief overview of some of the Pre Socratics in this video, and even that kind of introductory material that we've already started to cover in class. This is both for you, juniors, as well as your parents. I may have just called you sophomores a minute ago. My apologies for that. Regardless of which, if you need a refresher of what we did and what we're going to be tested on for the first assessment, please, this is the time to do so. So, we started off recognizing that philosophy goes very far back, right? Really, in some sense, insofar as we just mean philosophy as the love of wisdom, which is etymologically what we're talking about with the word philosophy, then we really can date it back as far as human records go. We can see a love for wisdom in the works of Job, right? In Holy Scripture, we can see the Proverbs. We can see even the life of Moses. All of this is very clear to be a sort of philosophical adventure. But we don't typically think of these figures and these writings as philosophy proper. Why not? Well, if we keep our definitions so broad, it seems to include anyone who's interested in the nature of anything. And that's fair. That's a fair understanding of philosophy, but we're going to want to limit our scope, at least for practical measures, for pragmatic purposes. And so most people will recognize that the Western world of philosophy starts in what we can think of broadly as Greek culture about 500 BC or thereabouts. And a lot of people will talk about Thales of Miletus being the first philosopher. And so, well, why are we starting there? Why are we not starting with Job? What is the thing that Thales does that's unique? And as we're going to see, he starts a kind of conversation between people that ripples throughout the generations. And it's really this back and forth and push and pull, which some philosophers later are going to see as the very essence of wisdom itself. But Thales begins this conversation. So he can be accredited as the first philosopher almost simply because people end up picking his works and picking them apart as much as it is for the reasons that of what he wrote. But if we're to look at what he wrote and try to say, why is this philosophical itself? One of the reasons that we are particularly interested in his work is he's asking, what is there in this world? When I look around, am I seeing one thing of which I'm a part of? Or am I seeing many things? If we can think of everything that exists as one thing, like the universe, right? That might be a poor translation even of the idea, because a contemporary understanding of the universe or of a multiverse or everything that exists, this would be maybe in one sense one thing, but we can also see different constituent parts to it. And so Thales begins this conversation of, okay, is there one or is there many? Now, if this is still kind of lost on you, think about a clock. On one level, we're going to want to say a clock is composed of various different parts and pieces, like gears and cogs and the hands and the face and all of that. But another level, we're going to recognize that it's ultimately one thing, right? And its oneness is the only reason for its multiplicity. If it didn't have that oneness, it wouldn't have anything that we can see as a multiplicity. Now, even that is kind of jumping ahead in the conversation. Even that kind of simple example is jumping too far ahead and pulling on some philosophical works that are going to develop. Thales is wanting to simplify that a little bit. And as he looks around the world, he notices that there's one thing in particular which seems to have precedence over all things, and this is water. So Thales, who's writing in Miletus, which is in modern-day Turkey, just across from the sea of what we now have as Greece, he's writing about 624 BC, and he is deciding that, it looks like all must be water. And there's a few reasons for this. He can account for change because of water. He can see, okay, there's something like various different forms of water. Water can be solid, it can be liquid, it can be gas. And so maybe it can be other things as well too, or it can at least have the appearance of other things. Or perhaps it's at the base level of all things. He recognizes that people seem to have water in them to at least some level. Trees and animals and plants seem to have water, and they seem to be dependent upon water. Water also appears, at least for Thales, to move on its own. It has motion. He looks at a river, it just seems to come up out of the ground moving. He sees rain coming down. He says, okay, water must be the fundamental unit of all things. And so all really is water. Now, that's an interesting thought. And it's interesting enough that it causes people to push back against it. So a few years after Thales dies in about 546 BC. And before he dies, someone named Anaximander by other pronunciation, is also working out of Miletus, and he is contemplating the work of Thales, and he says, Thales, you have it all wrong. All is not water, because water is already determined in some sense. Water already has a shape, or it has a form, or has something. Now, the language of shape and form is kind of, again, putting language that would evolve later onto Anaximander. But he says instead there's something like this indeterminate boundlessness, and that is a little vague, admittedly so. Anaximander is going to say that this indeterminate boundlessness is maybe something like what the medievals and the Aristotelians are going to talk about, like potency. There's a potential for things. And so he says, well, if I have potential and you have potential and all that we have around us has potential, we can imagine a world that exists prior to any sort of change that's happening to it, right? And so this primal world, or this world, is what we mean by this boundlessness, this indeterminate state. And from this boundlessness, all things are coming into a state of change, and that change is causing differences, but we can really just reduce it down to this boundlessness and then the change that springs or that happens to the boundlessness. Now, interestingly enough, Anaximander is also, from this, one of the first people that we have documentation of to propose a theory of evolution, right? He sees different plants and animals, and he says, if what we're ultimately coming from is this sort of potential before everything, and then change happens to that potential, and that's where we come as well as everything else come from, then it's likely the state that this change applied to various different animals. Now, he does not have a sort of Darwinian understanding of evolution by far. He has nothing like genetic mutations or anything that's more subtle. And he probably has some sort of idea where, like, one day a fish gives birth to a baby fox or something like that. And he does see that life must have come from water. So he's maybe borrowing from Thales in that sense, and then the water ends up coming into the fish, and the fish ends up coming into something else, and then eventually you get humans. And the reason he's also thinking about that too is he looks at humans and he says, it takes years and years and years for a human to come to a position of being able to be on our own. to be independent, to be able to be self-sustaining, to take care of ourselves, right? Even if we have a minimal level of kind of self-sustaining, at very least you need, parents to take care of you, or a group of people to take care of you for, 3-4 years. And that's really minimal. But he notices things like giraffes, right, can more or less get up and walk the first day that they're born. So he figures that at some point, some human had a parent that was not a human, okay? And that's kind of an interesting thing to think about. That level of looking at the world and thinking, how does this come to be, is taking place already in the 500-600 BC. Anaximander inspires Anaximenes, who is another Milesian philosopher, who's now responding to this idea that humans are this, or that all things are this kind of boundlessness, this indeterminacy. And he says that is too vague. It doesn't make any sense. Humans can't be some sort of indeterminacy or all things can't be some sort of indeterminacy, because we don't really know what that means. And so he's writing from about 385 to 328 BC. And he says, instead of an indeterminacy, let's say that all things are air. A-I-R, not error, E-R-R-O-R. Air, A-I-R. All things come from air. And by that, he means something slightly different from what Thales meant by all things are water. Instead, he recognizes that there is a relationship between quantity and quality. Says that air is the same thing as fire, is the same thing as earth, and is the same thing as water. It just depends on how much of it is compacted into a certain area. So fire is the most rarefied version. Air is the status quo. For whatever reason, he chooses that as the status quo. Water is condensed air, and then if you condense air even more, you get earth, according to Anaximenes. And so he has this understanding of the relation between quantity and quality, and says that things can change what they are based just off of how much there is. And so this is already starting to fuel the idea of what change is. And then, of course, the Greeks are going to develop an understanding of how these four basic elements, which many of them, as we'll see, use these four basic elements in order to create all things. Most famously, we're going to have humans that are made up of all four elements to a certain ratio of things. Most Greeks recognize that not all things are made up of all four elements, but humans are an interesting case. If you die, you leave us. If you were to leave a body on the ground for a while or in the dirt, it will break down into earth. Okay, so there's earth there. You touch a body and it's, as long as it's alive, it's warm. And so they would presume there must be some fire that's keeping it warm. We breathe, and so we have air in us. And then, of course, there's liquid running throughout us of various different forms. And so they presume that there's water with us as well, too. And so we're composed of a certain ratio of earth, wind, fire, and air. And as you can see with Anaximenes, he is figuring that these four different things are actually one thing, which he defines as air. Okay, so these are the Milesians from Miletus, thinking around 4 to 500 BC or 5 to 400 BC. And they are really hypothesizing that all is one, right? Whether that one is water or indeterminacy or air. After them comes Pythagoras. Now, Pythagoras is wanting to take an entirely different approach in the world. He's saying all is not one. Instead, all is number. Everything is number, fundamentally. And this means that all that exists is ultimately many. And this many is signified by the multiplicity of numbers. So famously, Pythagoras would write numbers down in the way that we oftentimes write dominoes today, right? Where you have like a point would be 1, 2 points would be 2, 3 points would be 3. And so he saw a very strong relationship between shapes and numbers, right? Because if I make 3 points in the way that he did, he would have a triangle. If I make 4 points, I have a square. If I make 2 points, I have a line. And so he understood that numbers were already informing the world and the world of forms, or that he had some sort of form to it as well, too. And so he concluded that, well, actually, all is many. And he even had a rather deep spirituality about him, or what we might think of as a deep mysticism about him. And Pythagoras had if we were to strip maybe the most pejorative context for it, he had kind of a cult-like following, the Pythagoreans, who just absolutely loved his stuff, because he would suggest that the fundamental goal in life is to rid yourself of some of the everyday stresses that you have that really aren't that important. To separate yourself from that and recognize that we need to contemplate the world as it exists in its eternal state, rather than being worried about, what shall I eat, or what shall I drink, or what shall I wear. And so he suggested that the best way to do this is actually spend time with numbers. This is, of course, how we get his most famous contribution, is the Pythagorean theorem. He spent a lot of time with numbers. He thought that numbers were a very important part of human health. And so because of that, he also thought about the relationship with numbers and everything else too. Music was a big thing. He noticed that if I take a string and I have it in tension, and if I was to pluck that string, and then I was to remember that note and have another string that is exactly half the length with just as much tension, that there's going to be an octave difference between those two notes. So recognize that if I divide that string in half, I also reduce the octave by 1. Look at that. There's an interesting relationship between music and numbers there. Similarly, he's going to recognize that, he's going to recognize a lot about music. We'll move on from that. We can get into a lot of the details with Pythagoras, but that's the important thing. Now, after Pythagoras, still about 500 BC, this is like 504 to 501 BC, the writings of Heraclitus come out. Now, Heraclitus is really interested in the problem of change. We saw this already with Anaximenes wondering how things can be changed, and even Anaximander, how things can be changed. But for Heraclitus, this is a really, really big problem, because he's going to be the first one that really recognizes that if something changes, it has to go from being to non-being, or from non-being to being in a certain way. And so he suggests that all things are kind of in this state of flux, and that there is something underlying all of the change, and that's what everything is made up of. But what we fundamentally have is just change. And so he says, kind of going off of the people that are before him, not all is not water, all is not air, all is fire. Because fire for him is really representative of change. Now, why would that be? Well, first off, fire is interesting because it consumes things. And it seems to bring about a change naturally in them. If I set a log on fire, eventually I'll be left with ashes. Or even if I put it out early, at least I'll be left with a charred log. It consumes what it's taken into it. It also gives off heat when you give it something. It gives off light when you give it something. And so it's this kind of fundamental change that takes place. And although there's something underlying all of that change for Heraclitus, when we ask what there is, we're really just left with the underlier and the change, and that's really all that everything can be made up of. Heraclitus suggests that fire, kind of like Anaximenes, fire can be condensed into water or congealed into earth. And so this really emphasizes that for him, it's not so much that all is just fire in some sort of loose way, like Thales was saying all is water, but that all is essentially change and that which is underlied by the change. This sparks Parmenides in about 510 BC. So writing just kind of prior to some of Heraclitus' major works, but still he's going to be dialoguing with what he knows of Heraclitus. Sparks Parmenides to suggest, no. This is not only wrong, but this is critically wrong, because Change itself is illusory. It's an illusion. There's no such thing as change. Now that seems crazy, right? We set fire to a log and it certainly looks like it changes. Parmenides actually takes this one step further, and he says not only is there no such thing as change, but there's no such thing as movement at all. He says all that exists as this one necessary being which cannot undergo any change. And so, because of that, we know that anything that looks like change is really just an illusion of some form. He doesn't state how the illusion works, to the best of my knowledge, but instead is just interested in saying, let's get rid of the idea that change actually happens. And he does this, later on we'll have language of what we might talk about as a priori versus a posteriori forms of knowledge. Now, a priori knowledge is knowledge that we can know simply by thinking about it, by knowing the relationship between things, and we seem to have an innate quality about us that allows us to do this, like all bachelors are unmarried men, or A equals A. Meanwhile, a posteriori knowledge is knowledge that we can get from experience. We can observe that if I drop something, it falls. And it seems to do that repeatedly, and so I can observe that there's some sort of force maybe, such as gravity, or at very least, I can observe that if I drop something in these circumstances, it will continue to fall. Parmenides suggests that anything like a posteriori knowledge, which again, he's not going to use that language, but we can use it readily for him. He's going to suggest that anything like that is uncertain, right? We can't actually trust our senses. Now, you know this if you've ever looked at a clock and the clock has been off a little bit, or you've looked at a wall and the lighting's not quite right and you don't judge the color correctly, or you're walking down the stairs late at night and you think that you've gotten to the second to the last step, but actually you're on the last step and you try to get to that last step and you feel funny. All these things are instances that our senses might be off, and so he's only really going to trust the things that he can pretty strictly deduce. And so he says, well, change is in of itself impossible. And so even though it looks like things change, I can't trust my natural senses in that sense, and so I'm going to say that nothing changes. And this is probably best noted not through Parmenides himself, but through one of his most avid advocates, Zeno. Zeno offers a series of different examples where he demonstrates that both change and motion, which he sees as a type of change, are impossible. One of the famous ones is he suggests, let's imagine a foot race between Achilles and a tortoise. Now, the tortoise is given a head start by Achilles because he's a good sport. Obviously, we would suggest that Achilles is going to, so long as the tortoise isn't so far ahead of him, is going to overtake the tortoise extremely quickly. But, he says, how would that happen? First, in order for Achilles to pass the tortoise, he would have to get halfway to the tortoise. But in order for him to get halfway to the tortoise, he would have to get halfway to the halfway point. In order for him to get halfway to the halfway point, he would have to get halfway to that halfway point, and so on and so forth ad infinitum. And so suddenly you realize that, well, Achilles has to pass an infinite amount of points before he can get to the tortoise. And so he must not be able to ever get to the tortoise, because you cannot pass an infinite amount of points. It's impossible, especially in a finite amount of time. Now, some people have pointed out that, well, Zeno, how do you pass through an infinite amount of times as well, too? Because you can divide time in the same way. And this might be a response to him, but actually it seems like it's just the same problem, right? How can I get from this moment to the next moment if there's an exactly halfway point in between this one moment and the next? And so on and so forth, again, ad infinitum. Zeno has a bunch of those different instances. He also suggests that an arrow can't actually move through space because it is only occupying one space at one instance of time. And since it's neither growing nor shrinking, if I was to freeze time, I would not have anything that would be able to propel the arrow forward, right? He doesn't have some sort of an understanding of inertia that we have today, right? A force that's acting upon it. And that's not a crazy response, right? The idea of forces are rather weird already, and so he's not assuming that. Nonetheless, he's saying these are instances that we can recognize that anything like motion, movement, or change is just an illusion. Okay, enter in the scene Empedocles. Now, Empedocles is writing a good deal later than Zeno. Zeno's born at 489. Empedocles is born 490, but he's really continuing all of his works up until 430, approximately. Empedocles is wanting to try to synthesize the views of people who have come before him. He recognizes that there's something to be said about Parmenides and Zeno saying that change is impossible and illusory. But also the Pythagoreans have something that's right when they suggest that the world is multiple and that numbers are the bedrock of reality. And so Empedocles suggests, maybe the world is eternal and unchanging, but rather than being one, like Parmenides and Zeno are going to say, and even the Meletians are going to say, the world is eternally many. Okay, so he kind of combines those ideas. He synthesizes the ideas of eternality and changelessness and multiplicity. So now we're no longer saying that the world is fundamentally one, but at very least we're going to say the world is kind of fundamentally four for Empedocles. And unsurprisingly, those four are earth, wind, fire, and air. That's kind of even difficult to understand because he has the first view of what we might call like bare particles or something like that, atoms as it's going to be. We'll see in just a moment, Leucippus and Democritus are really kind of the first atomists in a way that looks more like Newtonian physics. Empedocles is thinking that the world is made up of particles, but those particles, much like the world of if we think that all is air, right? Those particles can be condensed in four different ways, four primary ways. And it's the condensing of those four ways which make up the basic substance of things, and that's the eternality. So you can kind of get into a debate. Is he saying that particles are the bare cause of everything or the bare essence of everything? Or is he saying that earth, wind, fire, and air, which are themselves composed of particles, are eternal? And I'm not entirely sure about that for him, but he's wanting to bring those 2 points together. He suggests that there's also there's a natural force that is constantly playing with these different elements. And this natural force we could talk about as love and hate. We could talk about as harmony and discord. Or we could even talk about, to use more Eastern language, as yin and yang. It's the idea that, okay, so these four elements are constantly either being brought together or torn apart, brought together or torn apart. And so not dissimilar from when we're talking about Anaximenes with the rarefication of things and the separation of things and the fundamental changes that are happening there. For Empedocles, there's an actual force that's doing this. There's a force that's bringing about this change. And so we have, at its core, reality is these four elements composed of particles in certain ways, and a sort of strife, which is a technical word for him. A strife that happens to these elements, and this is able to explain everything. And we're constantly undergoing this strife. Well, after Empedocles, prior to Empedocles, but kind of coterminously with him, 500 to 438 BC, we have Anaxagoras. And Anaxagoras is saying, I'm with you, Empedocles, on some of those things, but it's not just some sort of bare force like strife, which is constantly ripping and putting together things, ripping apart and putting together things, but it's actually mind, or nous, which is going to be extremely important for Platonic and especially Neoplatonic philosophy. There's some sort of intellectual, fundamental nature of reality. And in doing this, Anaxagoras actually introduces this kind of idea of you have potency, which will eventually kind of become summarized in Aristotelian philosophy as matter, and mind, which is limitation, its order, its rationality, and so it informs the potency. And this is also a way of bringing together Parmenides' view. For Parmenides, all things are number. The numbers are some sort of delimitation of things. And now compare that with someone like Anaximander, who's going to recognize that there's this boundlessness and there's underneath all things is this potency. Anaxagoras is the first one that's kind of trying to bring these together, synthesizing in a way that Empedocles is doing. And unlike Empedocles, he's saying that rationality and mind is the thing that's underlying all of this. All right, that's a big part of the development that takes place. The only other two figures after that are worth talking about from the perspective of the Pre Socratics are Leucippus and Democritus, who are what we might think of as the first two atomic theorists. And as I mentioned before, they can have a version of atoms that is somewhat similar to what we see in Newtonian physics and really holds sway up until we get to quantum mechanics and Einsteinian physics. As this would suggest, they would say all things are fundamentally made up of atoms. And by atoms, they really seem to mean the smallest basic unit, right? So they would include that, like anything that's subatomic. They would just say there's something underneath it all, which are atoms. Now, they seem to suggest that every single substance has an infinite number of atoms. And I don't know how to make heads or tails of that, because it seems to overthrow their theory a little bit. How can something have an infinite number of atoms? The motivation sometimes for saying that there is a finite number of atoms would actually be a way of getting around some of Zeno's paradoxes, right? Suddenly, Achilles is able to pass by the tortoise because there's a finite number of atoms, and things are only divisible enough, but if you have an infinite number of atoms, how does that work? I don't know. Put that to the side. Leucippus and Democritus are going to propose this theory that all is atoms, and they're also going to propose the theory that there is something like empty space. Empty space is a receptacle that can receive things. And so you can put something in empty space. And so either, you can think of this as a binary of ones and zeros. The world is either composed of atoms or not atoms, right? Which is to say nothing. And this also kind of concedes some of the understanding of the Pythagoreans. Pythagoreans understood that there was binaries in this world, good and bad, and they could really visualize these as the basic binary codes 1 and 0, right? And so for Leucippus and Democritus, they're going to understand that the world is fundamentally either something or a lack of something which can receive something. Now, they're not going to have a really good way of explaining how that lack of something can have extension, right? And that's going to be a big problem for the Aristotelians. And say, how could a lack have extension? How can we say that there is empty space which is this big? Because that would seem to imply that empty space is this big and we have a problem of being. That's coming, so be aware of that. And indeed, most modern day physicians are going to recognize that something like true empty space is not physically possible for reasons of quantum mechanics. But there are other physicians that suggest, no, this is not only possible, but necessary. I take the route that empty space is nonsensical, personally. But it's being developed during this time, and it's important to keep that in mind. All right, that's a very fast overview of the Pre Socratics. That puts us up to about 425 BC. And for reference, remember we have the founding of the Roman Republic in 509 BC. So really, during all of this period of time, we have Western civilization is taking a form that is going to be extremely influential until today. As these thinkers are thinking, getting their ideas off the ground by bouncing them off of one another, and then setting the stage for what we're going to see for the latter half of this unit, being the Sophists, and then finally Aristotle himself. So that's what we're going to next. Hopefully this gives you a background for all of that. And like I said before, remember that your ideas have extreme consequences. As we're thinking through this, don't get to the perspective that you ever think that this is just theoretical. What you think here matters. It's of huge importance. And it has massive consequence on the way that you live your life. All right, I will see you in class, and then I will have some videos up for you on the Sophists and Socrates as well. Until then.